Okay, so a week and a half ago on Wednesday night, we talked about this responsibility to rebellion. And the part one of this responsibility to rebellion was when humans worship idols instead of God, we flip the world upside down, right? So I'm going to go fast through this review for the sake of time. So there is a hierarchy to the world, the way the world works. God set the universe up to actually function a certain way with God at the top. You can see here world or worlds, depending on how you want to break it up. There is a non-physical world, the heavenly world, the unseen world, the world where God and his angels, his celestial family, as I will likely refer to them most as, they live and dwell in this non-physical world. Even the dead humans have gone on to this non-physical world. They live and dwell this place, right? God's at the top. He's the only uncreated being. But what did we see when we got to Genesis 1 a week and a half ago? He talked to this us. He said, let us make man. There was more creatures there than just God. And that was him talking to the angels. You know, pick a term. The reason I don't like angels, and I said this, and you can find it on YouTube, is because angels, that Greek word just means messenger. It's a very low-ranked being that inhabits this world. The celestial family itself could be broken up into all sorts of categories and hierarchy. God sits at the top. He created all of these beings, but by the time he creates the physical world, these beings are already in existence. So when we read Genesis 1 and we see God talking and saying, let us make man, he's talking to his celestial family. Okay, that's important. They rule and they reign in the celestial world, the non-physical world, the heavenly realm. Pick a term, okay? There's lots of different terms that you could pick. This is kind of the language that you'll hear me use to talk about the same thing, okay? Then in Genesis 1, he picked up with creating the physical world. And he put order and structure to the physical world with humanity on the top because they're God's image bearers. They rule alongside him. They administer his world, his reign in the physical world. God is king over the non-physical world, but now he's setting up a kingdom in a physical world. And he's putting humanity at the top to be kings and queens, rulers, governors, principals, parents, authority figures in the physical world to administer his structure and his reign in the physical world. Humanity at large has control over the animals who are underneath humanity's authority, and then you have the objects and the non-living creatures underneath them. And you see, he builds this order, right? Because these things are created first, then the animals, the sun, moon, and stars are created first, then the animals, then humanity is created last because they're on top to govern everything else that's been made. So it looks like this. You could put a triangle around this, and maybe I'll go back and do this, but God's at the top. The angels are underneath God. They're higher than humanity, but starting with the angels, all of this is created by God. So of course it's supposed to be under his authority. Humanity over here starts governing the physical world, the animals and the sun and the moon. All of this was completely obvious to the ancient world, okay? I have to start with this as the beginning because everybody who wrote scripture assumed all of this to be true. They don't spell it out. They don't start at the beginning and say, point 1, God created everything. Point 2, God created the angels. Point 3, God created, I'm systematizing and structuring this to explain it to you. But everybody in biblical times just knew it and assumed it. Okay? So we have to adopt this kind of thinking to be able to read our Bibles, and that's what we're getting at. The physical world was made to function with God as the head and king of the universe. Humanity was supposed to be following him obediently as his subordinate image-bearing kings and queens who together rule the created world until God's destination and vision for the created world actually came about. We looked at Genesis 1, 26 through 28. We looked at Psalm 8, 5 through 8, which talks about humanity being placed a little bit lower than the what? The heavenly beings. Remember, we looked at that in the Net Bible translation. Hebrews 2, I added to this. We did not look at this. Hebrews 2, 5 through 9 quotes Psalm 8 and is talking about the world to come being subjected to humanity, not to the angels. And so there's something there that relates to the same idea, the same structure that the author is actually trying to get at here. The world, the universe, physical or non-physical, is meant to function a certain way. There is a hierarchy to the created universe. Created as God's image bearers in the physical world, humanity was made to rule over the physical world under God's authority, right? We don't just have free reign, and we don't just get to do whatever we want. So we possess authority from God over living creatures, and yet we remain under God's authority. At least this would be the ideal. We have a responsibility towards God. So this is the idea of responsibility. So then what happened to the world? We went from responsibility to rebellion. The first rebel, the serpent, the snake, Adam, Eve, what happened is the serpent offered us a different voice to potentially listen to. And instead of listening to the voice of God, we listened to the voice of a lesser being, a created angelic celestial being. And we stopped remaining under God's sole authority. The world is screwed up because we rebel, not because God is cruel or unjust. The world is screwed up because we won't submit and listen to God, and we have fractured the way creation is actually supposed to function. All of these bits, all of these in between, supposing to interrelate a certain way, and we just undid the whole thing when we started listening to creation rather than the Creator. And that's what we ended with. We decided to rebel against God and take what He didn't want us to have, the forbidden fruit. We listened to a created being over the Creator. And in Genesis 3, it's the serpent. In other places, it'll be other created beings. We flipped the world upside down when we did this. That's why the world is so broken. That's why the world is so dysfunctional. We value the fruit as more worthwhile than obedience to God. We thought the serpent was more worthy to follow in obedience than the serpent's own king. We could break that down a lot more, but that's just the summary plot points of Genesis 1 all the way down through Genesis 3. But basically, in the end, this is what happened. We became idolaters. We became people who worship creation above the Creator. And we've already looked at that out of Romans 1 a lot. We'll look at a few other passages today, but I'll give you a lot more up on screen that go into this. But I mean, the entire Bible is filled with this and assumes this as the background. Everybody's an idolater. Okay, I should not have to harp on that, and you should for the rest of your days. Remember that you are an idolater. You worship creation above the Creator. We've been talking about this in the context of how much worship, glory, and honor we give our screens rather than we actually give the Creator. So we'll continue on this, but this is the context for redeeming the screen. If you want to use your screen correctly, you're going to actually have to put God back on the throne of your life. So we had an anti-creation hierarchy. Humanity's still stuck in the middle, but the rest of creation is supposed to be below us and God's supposed to be above us. We cast God down to be below us as less valuable, and we took creation and we cast it up above us, whether it's a heavenly creation like the serpent, whether it's the fruit, whether it's other things that we'll talk about today. We flipped the world upside down, and it's not working and functioning properly. And what I want to talk to you about today, with my last day before surgery, From Responsibility to Rebellion, Part 2. If you won't worship God, you will just worship a substitute. We already defined an idol as a cheap substitute for God, right? So this is what we're going to break down here this morning. It's not an option to not worship something. We defined worship as giving your time, your attention, and your affection. Valuing something as what? Worthship. defining something as being worthy to follow and obey, and therefore giving your love, your time, your attention to it. That is what worship is. If you won't give that to God, you will give it to something else. And we're going to talk about what other options are out there in a little bit more details today. So, humanity has a responsibility to worship. It's not exactly a compulsion. It's part of your being. You can't help it. You value some things as better than others. And you value and worship some things as gods. Because we were created to actually worship God. Let's get into this a little bit. So, of course, in Genesis 1, humanity was given the responsibility to rule, but we were also given the responsibility by the Creator to actually worship Him. We owe our life and our existence to Him. You owe it to God because He gave you the breath of life to acknowledge Him as the giver of life, to correctly proclaim that all things come from Him and give Him credit and follow Him as God. This is what worship is. It's not just singing a bunch of songs, which we kind of tend to boil it down to these days. So, the proper response to being given the responsibility is worship. That's just a tongue-tied way of trying to say this in a simple sentence. Not so simple. You got a question? Okay, just making sure. All right. So, in the past, some Christians have defined it this way. They ask the question, what is the chief end of man? This comes from the Westminster Catechism, and they wrote it in about 1647. It was accepted and published around 1648. So this has been around for almost 400 years. They've asked the question and answered it like this. And I think this is a great simplistic way to say it. What is the chief end of man? What is the purpose of life? Why are we here? Why do we exist? Why were we given life to begin with? And they say man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Have you ever thought about the reason you live as being able to enjoy God? How do you go about enjoying God? These passages here in this first column, Psalm 86 down to Revelation 4:11, is about glorifying God, the responsibility to worship. And then the second column here, Psalm 16 and all the way down to Revelation 21, is all about enjoying Him. You get the most enjoyment and fulfillment out of your life if you will actually correctly relate to God in worship and in honor and in following and obedience to Him. This is the point that the Westminster Catechism is trying to make. You don't need to go. You can look up the Westminster Catechism online at any point. This is just the very first question, Q1 and answer, the very beginning of the Catechism. And what that means is like, these are the questions we ask when we're publicly gathered to worship so that people can remember and learn something. You know, it was their way of doing a Bible study back then. Okay? No need to freak out about the word catechism. The man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. We don't have time to look over all of this. It's on the recording, so you could take a picture with your phones right now and look them up later, or you can go back to the recording and find them. I'm just going to focus on Revelation 4:11 and Revelation 21:3 and 4 up on the screen now. A little bit before that, to get a running start, Revelation 4 is a scene where John, who's writing the book of Revelation, is taken up into heaven to see these visions. And while he's in the very throne room of God, he sees these living beings, is what they get translated as. They're angelic celestial beings, but they're high-ranking creatures because they're guardians of God's throne to make sure that nobody else comes any closer. God's throne has to be protected from unclean things coming any closer. So they sit in front of it, and then everybody else is gathered around it. And verse 9 starts by saying, whenever the living beings give glory and honor and thanks to the one sitting on the throne, the one who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders who are immediately in front of those living beings, they fall down and they worship the one sitting on the throne, the one who lives forever and ever. They lay down their crowns before the throne and they say, you are worthy, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things. They exist because you created what you pleased. So this goes back to the idea of saying in heaven, the reason heaven, in the throne room of God, heaven is at peace and heaven is perfectly functioning is because everybody there actually gives God proper worship and credit. They acknowledge him as their creator. All things means these angelic beings, these celestial beings, were created by God, the only uncreated being. He was pleased to do it. They're happy for their existence and they worship him alongside of it. So if that's the heavenly world, the non-physical world, what about the physical world? Well, in the future, it'll look like this. Revelation 21, verses 3 and 4. I heard a loud shout from the throne, the same throne, the person sitting on the throne in the previous verses we looked at, God. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, look, God's home is now among his people. Where do people live? Earth. Good. People live on earth. God's home is now on earth. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All of these things are gone forever because God has acted between Revelation 4 and Revelation 21. God has acted to judge and destroy all of the people and all of the angelic beings and the celestial beings, no matter how ranking they are, no matter how powerful the humans were. He's destroyed all of them who refused to actually worship and honor him, who refused to come back and submit to him as king. He has destroyed them all. And he has taken those who have actually submitted to him, acknowledged him as king, and lived their lives under his rule, and he's given them the entire creation. And he's come and he's lived down here with us, made his home amongst them, the same way that he lives in heaven with these angelic beings now. In the future, his goal is to live that way here on earth, in perfect peace, no more pain, no more crying, and no more shame. And we are caught in between his plan to do that and his fulfillment of doing that. Our world is still chaotic. Our world is still in disarray and dysfunction because we don't want to properly worship God and give him credit. And if we don't properly worship and give credit to God, we will just give credit or worship to something else. Why? Because that's what idolaters do. It's supposed to be because that's what heroes do, right? You know the quote from Thor Ragnarok, but that's what idolaters do. We worship something. You're not going to get around it. The question is, what kind of options are out there to worship? What other things do we put in place of God, ignoring our responsibility to worship God? Option one, well, you could worship other gods, which in English we typically refer to as demons. Okay? It's not exactly that simplistic, but the non-physical beings that used to serve God, like the serpent, instead they pretend to be gods. They seduce and draw our attention towards them away from God and get us to worship and serve them. And in the New Testament, they get called demons. And typically that's what a term we'll stick with. I already mentioned the serpent, but you see the first rebel, even before humanity rebelled, the serpent was rebelling against God. He told humanity that they won't die. He made promises that he had no right or ability to make. Oh, you're not going to die. God just knows that the second you eat this fruit, you're going to be like the rest of us, knowing good and evil. So he's claiming to be a God. You know what? I can tell you things that God can't. I will tell you. I'll make you promises that God doesn't make. God says you're going to die. You won't die. If you just follow me and you just listen to me, listen to my voice, do what I say, and eat the fruit. That's a false God. And humanity ultimately gave allegiance to this serpent. You can see that in Genesis 3. You can follow that with a thread throughout Scripture in these other passages, Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, where God judges the rest of the gods meaning the angelic, non-heavenly, non-physical heavenly beings that rebelled against him. Not just the serpent, but beginning with the serpent. All the other ones that followed the serpent and did this. In Psalm 82, God assembles his council and says, you guys are going to die just like normal humans here. You thought you were immortal, but I'll destroy you too for doing this. Heads up there. So one, you could actually worship lesser beings, other gods and idols by worshiping angelic, non-physical beings that have rebelled against God. Option two, you could worship physical creation. Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments. Okay, that's where they're originally found. And the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. And that's kind of reflecting back on option one, other gods. They mean something by that we typically don't understand. No other gods. Don't give your allegiance to other created beings beside me. And if you worship me, don't worship me by worshiping an idol. You don't turn God, an uncreated being, into a physical created being and worship him. That is improper worship. If you worship an idol, what you're really worshiping is these other gods. So these commandments, 1 and 2, are fundamentally linked to give us option 2. You could worship a physical creation. And if we broke that down a little bit further, you get the obvious pagan worship that worships the sun and the moon and the stars and the powers that govern our human lives, right? You get all these verses that actually talk about that. Romans 1:23 that says, professing to be wise, they turned themselves into fools and they worshipped created things rather than the Creator, who is supposed to be worshipped and blessed forever. Amen. We've already looked at that on previous Wednesdays. Go back and watch the YouTube videos on all of that. So you could literally worship creation, but there's other more subtle ways that you could do it. You could worship parts of creation like substances, alcohol, drugs, all of that stuff. Or you could just be a materialist. You could think that physical creation is all that there is, and you could give all the value and the joy to material creation. You ever heard the phrase, whoever dies with the most toys wins? Get rich or die trying? These are kind of common phrases that basically say, our purpose for here has nothing to do with God. Just make money, make yourself happy, and buy whatever's going to make you happy. Spend money however you want. Do whatever is going to make you happy. And this materialistic idea that says there's nothing but the physical universe isn't making us happy. We've already talked about this in some regards, right? People try and throw pills at the depression problem in our world, in our society these days, because they're trying to think that people are merely physical creations. And we talked about the fact that doesn't work because we're not purely physical beings. We are both physical embodied beings, but we have a non-physical aspect to our beings. Just as these non-physical beings that reside in the heavenly world, they can take on human form. They can come and exist in the physical world, and they do it in order to fulfill God's will in the physical world. So you could be an idolater by just giving the creation all the credit, and you could do it in a lot of different ways. You could break it down, and there's one more option here. Option number 3. We could worship ourselves. We could, and this kind of overlaps with all of this, physical creation, materialism. Well, we just put the main physical material being as ourselves. And you could see all sorts of examples of people doing this in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 14 and again in Isaiah 47, you get Babylon, or in Isaiah 14, it's the king of Babylon specifically. In Isaiah 47, it's like all of Babylon is claiming to be a god, claiming to be great and immortal and everlasting. In Ezekiel 28, you get the king of Tyre, which is a city. I think it was off the coast. Nobody ever conquered it until Alexander the Great built a roadway out there from the coast all the way out, like 5-10 miles off sea, to conquer Tyre. And so Ezekiel, writing before that ever happened, says, Tyre, you are such arrogant jerks thinking yourselves to be greater than you are, calling yourselves gods, worshiping yourself in your own glory for making all this money and being impenetrable, but someday you too are going to be conquered. Of course, Alexander the Great finally conquers them. Until then, they'd never been conquered. The little-known prophet of Obadiah, because his book is only 12 verses long, so the entire book is a judgment against Edom, a relative nation of Israel, going back in the book of Genesis, other descendants of Abraham that's not Israel, who bullied and actually aligned themselves with Babylon to destroy the kingdom of Israel. And Obadiah says, you guys are such jerks and such arrogant, self-loving, self-worshiping people that you're going down too. So you see this option everywhere in an obvious form. It's basically going back to that hierarchy of creation, and we put ourselves in a higher position than we're actually meant to occupy. By that I mean, if we go back to this screen here, it's saying, okay, instead of properly fitting in our position here, let's make ourselves out to be gods. Let's make ourselves out to be eternal beings whose rule will never end. This is exactly what the language of Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 in particular are talking about. You guys have tried to exalt yourself higher in the pecking order than you were created to be. And you're deceived into thinking that you're actually up there. You're not. And that's why you're going to be brought down and destroyed. There you go. We attempt to turn ourselves into a god rather than accept our human limitations. Example, politicians do this all the time. Every time a politician makes a promise that they can't keep, and they lie about it, and yet they actually believe their own press that they're capable of doing things they're not capable of doing, they make themselves out to be higher than they are. And in a fundamental way of looking at that, the way the Old Testament and the New Testament looks at that, is to say, oh, we're actually gods. You might as well worship and draw all the attention to us because we're worth it. We rule over you because we're better than you. Give us glory, give us honor. Give us your vote because we're worth it. And the Old Testament version of that is these politicians, these kings and conquerors in all of these places. So I'm just trying to make a modern parallel. But ultimately, idolatry always boils down to self-worship. Because whether you're worshiping physical material, or whether you're worshiping yourself as the physical God, or whether you're worshiping an idol, you're making a decision that something is worth it, and you're exalting yourself to decide this is worthy. I declare this to be worthy. Zeus is my God. He is worthy because he's strong. He's worthy because he takes what he wants. And you're making a set of value statements and worshiping certain things above others. And you're turning it into worshiping an object, you're turning it into worshiping an idea, you're turning it into worshiping a person, but ultimately you're deciding yourself that you're going to worship something you're not meant to worship. And ultimately, when you choose that and you bow down to it, you're really, in the end, worshiping yourself. And this is why it's so easy for people who worship gods to turn around and worship themselves. These pagan cultures like Babylon, Tyre, Edom, Assyria, all the other, Persia, all the ones we looked at around Christmas, right? They end up exalting themselves to the status because they've chopped down a tree, turned it into a statue, and then worship that statue. Instead of worshiping the creator of the tree, they worship the tree itself. And their eyes and their minds and their hearts have become as dead, as dumb, as unthinking as that tree that they're bowing down to because, as I've said before, you become like the thing that you worship. And in so doing, they start thinking incorrectly that they're higher in the created pecking order than they actually are. And then they start thinking, well, maybe I don't need to just worship this. Maybe I am that. And it always comes back around to worshiping yourself. If you live long enough as a pagan, as an idolater, ultimately you will devolve into worshiping yourself. And when it comes to worshiping our screens, ultimately we're making a decision and a value of saying, The things I like on YouTube, the things I like on TikTok are worthy of my time and my attention. We start worshiping them and claiming value and worth to them. And then you start acting like the people that you see on TikTok. You start picking up their words, their phrases, their mannerisms, because you've given so much time to them in your thinking, so much worship to them in your heart, that they're now affecting you, and you're starting to live out what you see on the end of the screen. And if you see on the end of the screen godly things and biblical values and quality stuff, you'll start actually living a godly life. But if you're just there to see your own self reflected back at you, if you're just there to see, okay, the things that I want and the things I want to be, the things that I value in my own heart and mind, I want to see there, and I want to start emulating it and stuff. Now you're just in kind of an echo chamber, feeding it all back to yourself, and you're worshiping yourself, and it's all about you. And all of a sudden, if everybody starts doing that, you get a society, not unlike our own, that is completely and utterly narcissistic, where everybody actually, despite the fact that they are pure physical beings, claim things like non-binary status. What is that? You heard of that? You seen that on your social medias and stuff? People claiming that they're what? They're not men, they're not women, they're non-binary, right? You seen that? Grant, you're rolling your eyes, okay? So you've seen that. You know what you're ultimately declaring? Oh, I wasn't closed all the way, and when the air conditioning kicked on, it just came open. You can close it if you want. You're ultimately claiming that instead of being a being of the physical world, you're a being of the non-physical world. Oh, you're higher in the ranking order because angels don't have gender. Why? Because they're not physical creations. They take on gender when they have to actually interact with the physical world, but they have no inherent gender. And for a bunch of created beings who God made male or female to declare, well, I'm non-binary, I'm not this or that or something. Yes, you are. But for you to claim that is for you to be an idolater who's exalted yourself to being a god, a non-physical being. Why were you born in the physical world to begin with if you were actually of that status? I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. But it is this self-worth. And the expectation is everybody will acknowledge it and everybody will bow down and obey it. If I declare myself to be a god, you had darn sure better bow down and declare the same thing. How dare you stand against me and declare that I'm not a god? You're not a god. Look, I'm just going to look in the camera and say this. If you're out there and you're thinking, if you're so self-deceived that you actually think you're not a physical being, or that you somehow transcend the laws of the physical universe, you are an idolater who has exalted yourself to be a god. You are not a god. You are a human. I do not worship you. I do not give a crap what you think. You are deceived and you need to repent. You need to accept that only one is God and deserves worship, and that ain't you. And until you do that, you will always be dysfunctional. You will always have a problem in the physical world. You will always be confused and you will always be sad. Come and make peace with your God. That option is available to you as well. But you have to give up on the idea that you are in any way, shape, or form a God. You are just a person, and that's okay. Just like me. So all of this applies to you as well. So I want you to ponder some things while I'm gone from being away for surgery, okay? What if you are worshiping the wrong God? Would you even know it? If you were giving so much time, attention, and affection to the created world above the Creator, would you even know that you were doing it? If you are, and you are a pagan and idolater, maybe you need to stop and think what you're actually worshiping. Are you giving too much love and attention to physical creation? How much love and attention do you give to God each day? How much is He actually in your mind? How much are you thinking about Him and giving thanks to Him as your Creator? It tells you how much you're worshiping Him. Which of the three types of idolatry that we've talked through today do you think you struggle with the most? Probably not option one. Probably not worshiping the sun, moon, and stars or any other physical creation. But maybe you give too much time to food. And maybe you worship food and you struggle with eating habits or something. Maybe it's that type of substance. That's a big thing in our culture. Maybe it's just worshiping yourself and giving too much time and credit to yourself. And maybe the way that shows up is that you don't actually think enough about God each day. But you don't deny yourself anything you want to do. You want to play video games, you hop on video games. God wants to spend a little time with you, you ignore God. That tells you what you worship and what you value. Because in the end, your screens go somewhere in this structure that we've talked about today. And you're going to have to decide for yourself and work out for yourself where your screens fit in, how to properly use them. Because in the end, if you won't worship God, you will worship a substitute. But if you will worship God correctly, you will flip the world right side up. And when I get back, this is what we're going to start talking about. We're going to turn our minds to what it means for what God did in Jesus to flip the world right side up by putting the right image bearer at the top of the food chain again.